Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Gleneagles University. And tonight, we're so happy to have you here. We're going to be talking about Van Gogh. Rather, Dr. Karen Leader is going to be talking about Van Gogh. And we have a huge audience tonight. I'm very happy that we were able to do this safely and virtually. And thank you all for coming. Again, this is going to be recorded and we will put this up on our YouTube channel. So if you have anybody that has missed this out of the membership, they can easily go to YouTube and we'll probably have it up tomorrow. So we'll have some questions afterwards for Dr. Leader. And we know that some of you on tonight went with me over the summer to see the Van Gogh immersive experience, even though that's not exactly what we're going to be talking about tonight. I think Dr. Leader is going to touch on it, but we are looking forward to finding out some things we didn't know about Van Gogh. So Dr. Leader, welcome. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks. It is great to be here. I wish I was there in person. I really miss seeing you all, but I'm glad we can do this safely. I have a couple of preliminary warnings. I was in California over the holidays. I hung out with family and children and of course caught their cold. So I've been fighting to get my voice back. It's almost completely back, but it is a little raspy. So I apologize for that. And I have water at hand if I start coughing. Some people asked about my background. That is the Rose Reading Room of the New York Public Library. I wish I was there. I'm not. I'm in Boca Raton, downtown, but I love this background and I think it's very appropriate for me to talk out loud in the middle of a library where you're supposed to be very quiet and whispering. So enjoy. So I don't know if I know more than you all know because Tammy was telling me you watched some movies. Some of you visited the immersive exhibition, which I have not visited. But I've been lecturing about Vincent for many years. And every time I do, I learn new things about this extraordinary artist. And so what I'm going to do is spend the first part of the talk mainly doing a little bit of biographical and timeline kind of introduction. Some of it might be familiar to some of you, but also, of course, showing beautiful images. So that alone is worth the effort. And then in the latter part of the talk, I'm going to bring to bear some more recent art historical scholarship, some interpretive and analytical work to sort of deepen our understanding. I will leave time at the end for questions, and I also would love to hear some of your insights about the movies you watched, the immersive exhibition if you went, and maybe any other experiences you've had with seeing this artist's work in person, because there's really nothing quite like seeing it in person. So I want to start by giving you a visual of Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, if I'm being true to the correct pronunciation. Self-portrait from 1887. We'll see several self-portraits. They are all different. They are all performances of self in various guises, which I will point out. And I want to start with a quote from the artist himself, because I think it sets out some of the mood of the kind of searching intellect that he had and creative mind that he had. Quote, I always have the impression of being a traveler going somewhere, to some destination. If I say to myself, this somewhere, this destination does not exist, it seems to me to be true and well-reasoned. And at the end of my career, I will be in the wrong. I will then find out that not only the fine arts, but even the rest were nothing but dreams, and oneself was nothing at all. Now, I've read that quote many times, and it has the tone of being rather defeatist, but I think it's not. I think it's Vincent's refusal to be right about anything, because once you're right about something, you stop searching, you stop creating, you stop trying. And so he keeps traveling deeper into his art, deeper into his research, and deeper into the relationships that he builds over his lifetime. Here's another self-portrait, quite different from the last one.
Yeah, he looks like a prisoner.
Yeah,
Like
no, you can make it louder, right? It's very low.
This is a self-portrait that Vincent dedicated to the artist Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, who I'm going to speak about a little bit later. And
For a long time.
he said himself that it was meant to resemble a Buddhist monk. It's from 1888, just a year after the last one I showed you. And just to give one other example of the specificity of Vincent's practice, he described the background color, and I don't think it reproduces very well because true color never really does, but he described it as pale malachite, which is very precise. It's not blue, it's not vaguely turquoise, it is pale malachite. And that leads me to the first main point that I really want to make about Vincent van Gogh, which is that he wasn't mad. He wasn't the mad painter. And his art wasn't simply therapy to exorcise his demons. And I've spoken about this once before when I talked about Van Gogh at Gleneagles in the context of post-impressionism, but I want to deepen that a little bit in this visit. One of the things about Van Gogh is that he got made into the poster child for what I call the tortured genius. And it did a tremendous disservice to his art. And so I want to unpack what I mean by saying that he wasn't mad and he didn't paint as therapy, simply. He did suffer from mental instabilities. The diagnoses are still kind of open-ended, whether he was bipolar, whether he suffered from lead poisoning, whatever else might have been the maladies that he suffered from, he did have mental instabilities. And painting and drawing was the place where he found a sense of calm when he needed it. And we'll talk about that more in a bit as well. But he also read 4 languages. He was completely up to date in the latest fashions, trends, politics, artistic styles. He had lengthy and detailed epistolary, meaning letter writing, conversations with learned friends and family, where he very carefully teased out what he was after, things like pale malachite and an icon with the appearance of a Buddhist monk, another way that he described this work. And when I say his art wasn't therapy, I mean that his art was about art. It wasn't about him. And it wasn't about healing himself. And if that is all it had been, it wouldn't be the body of work that we still travel the world to see today, and that you can get millions of people to go to an immersive exhibition of because they want to know more and learn more and see more. That said, he was a prodigy, although he failed at several careers before discovering his prodigious talent. He failed at being an art dealer. He failed at being a seminarian. Some of his relationships failed. But he only began drawing in 1881, and he died in 1890. And by 1887, 6 years into his self-teaching, he became fully the artist that we recognize today. which is remarkable. He produced in that short time 1,600 works in drawing, painting, etc. A distinctive style, unlike anyone else's, distinctive brushwork, distinctive color harmonies, distinctive framing and cropping and composition. And yet he sold one painting in his life. So an extraordinarily complex artist who has suffered from the stereotyping and caricaturing of the tortured genius. He learned from manuals. He learned from copying. He learned from learning to draw from what's called a perspective frame, which does half of the work for you in being able to produce the appearance of 3 dimensions on a flat surface. His approach throughout was decidedly conscious and diligent. He was always aware of what was going on in his home country in the Netherlands and later in France. His letters, of which there are about 700 extant, preserved by his sister-in-law, Theo's sister, record what Stephen Eisenman calls, quote, a self-conscious gloss upon a vast, ambitious, and complex body of art, unquote. He also had a very strong interest in the graphic arts, and so he read newspapers and studied illustrations and advertisements. He had a deep interest in Japanese art, which we'll talk about again in a moment, and popular illustration, including caricatures, which is what my specialization is. And so some of his work has a caricatural or cartoony quality, which I will point out in a minute. He also was Dutch and deeply rooted in Protestantism, and he pursued an ecclesiastical training and career, which ultimately failed. And to some degree, art then became his religion. And I will say more about that. In his youth, he pursued a religious mission, which sought a kind of pre-industrial past. And I will call attention to that in how his work tends to be very close to the earth, to nature, to the peasant, and away from the urban industrial revolution. He also did see art as an expression of the ego. And he saw himself, and we recognize this in his letters, as a suffering individual, but not suffering because he suffered from mental instability, but suffering because he was so passionate about it, wanting to find an authentic voice in this religion of art, to honor those whom he selected for his works. Between 1872 and 1890, when he died, as I said, he wrote nearly 700 letters to his brother, the art dealer, Theo. And they were first published by Johanna Bonger, who was Theo's wife. And you can find them all online today. And in addition to publishing the letters, many of Van Gogh's letters were illustrated with sketches. And museums are fond of placing these illustrated sketches next to completed paintings. The Morgan Library in New York, for example, possesses both finished paintings and illustrated letters. And to see them together, you can see how meticulous and how concerted his efforts were, how far away they are from painting as therapy. His work starts in what would be considered a Dutch genre, which is the interior, what we call a genre scene or domestic interior. This is Van Gogh's most famous early work called The Potato Eaters. It is in the Dutch tradition, but it was also inspired, as were other works that I'm going to show, by the French realist artist Millet. That's M-I-L-L-E-T, Millet. There are about 20 studies in preparation for this work. And this is the finished work that resides in the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands. He himself wrote that it speaks of manual labor. It speaks of how these individuals sitting around a humble table, drinking coffee and eating potatoes, the fruit of the earth, right, have honestly earned their meal. The light quality, that single light hanging over them, casting shadows and reflections across the humble interior, has an almost sacramental or holy quality to it, and provides a sort of symbolic significance to this humble meal. It is also largely a tonal painting. You notice there's very little actual color. No colors really pop. And so it exists in cool colors of browns, grays, and blacks, with contrasts of white for the potatoes and light for that light, with subtle undertones of blue and green. The main expression comes through contour. For instance, this hat, the light shining on the side of this one, and through the tone, this somber tone. But I don't think we should ignore that there's a strain or a tension to this work as well. Despite celebrating the fruits of their harvest, they all appear rather underfed, and perhaps even exaggeratedly caricatural. If you look at caricatures of the same time, the exaggerated faces, the long noses, appear not realist, but in some ways uncouth. And thus, those qualities diffuse the kind of sentimental romanticism of the work, giving it a raw presentness that makes us feel like we're there in this chilly interior. Theo, Van Gogh's brother, supporter, champion, interlocutor, encourages him to go to Paris, the center of the art world. And here's a self-portrait that presents him in a decidedly more urban fashion, with a gray felt hat, buttoned up coat, high collar. He does, and he takes in the vibrant second half of the 19th century Parisian cosmopolitan, metropolitan energy, the height of Impressionism, the beginnings of post-Impressionism. He is introduced to colors filled with light, whose brushwork has been relieved of its highly illusionistic duty. He visits the 8th Impressionist exhibition, the final one, and the one whereby artists like Seurat, who I talked about when I lectured on post-impressionism, introduced his scientific experiments with color and light, his neo-impressionism. And he saw Seurat's An Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. He copied Japanese woodcut prints, and he saw the works of Gogh and the expressionist potential of color. And he begins painting vaguely urban scenes instead of the country, humble peasant people of the Netherlands. And for a while, his painting is recognizably rooted in modern Paris. This is a work called Moulin De La Galette from 1886, that year of the last Impressionist exhibition. And of course, Montmartre, where the Moulin de la Galette was located, was an artistic colony of sorts from the late 19th century well into the 20th century, because there were inexpensive loft type spaces to rent. A galette is roughly a pancake, and the Moulin de la Galette, the windmill of the pancake, was in fact a working bakery that made rye cakes that the owner sold with milk. The Moulin de la Galette was made up of two mills that, of course, grind wheat or rye. But what the Moulin de la Galette means in a modern painting is an entertainment district where there were cafes and outdoor concerts and nightclubs and cheap entertainment. And so it was a hotspot, if you will. And other painters painted Montmartre, like Toulouse-Lautrec, for example, as much more of a hotspot. Whereas Van Gogh is still sort of rooted in an old school romanticizing tradition. And he treats the Moulin de la Galette more as a picturesque motif than as a hotspot or urban sensibility. And here's my picture of the modern day Moulin de la Galette from when I was in Paris many years ago. He did tiptoe toward modern scenes. This is another work from Paris called La Guinguette. And La Guinguette was a working class cafe. You can see the waiter with his top coat and long apron, and individuals sitting at outdoor tables that we crave now in the age of pandemic. And this has something more of an urban sensibility than the previous one, but again, it doesn't suggest the trendiness of Montmartre or the experience of modernity that other artists like Manet, Morisot, Monet, Pissarro, or Seurat were capturing with such immediacy. Vincent remained in some ways rooted a bit in the past. And so when he does take on the motif of modern Paris, it still has the appearance of a traditional Netherlandish or Dutch landscape painting. This is a rare, actually rare for any artist, painting of factories. Factories being a modern industrial technology, the result of the Industrial Revolution. You can see the broad swath of a field, old school production, agriculture, the old version of the French economy, is given over fully half of the canvas. And then the industrial town of Asnières and the smokestacks spewing either steam or smog into the sky is given the other half of the canvas. And in some ways, here, the artist equalizes the older agricultural economy that was going by the wayside as agriculture itself became industrialized and more individuals moved closer and closer to industrialized cities in search of wage labor, like factory work. So this is an ambiguous image. He doesn't choose to privilege one over the other in this particular image. Here's a comparison of a traditional 17th century Netherlandish painting by Jacob van Ruysdael called Bleaching Grounds near Haarlem from roughly 2 centuries earlier at the peak of what we call the Dutch Golden Age of painting. These two paintings are roughly about the same thing. They're about commerce. They're about hard work. You can see the worker here, right in the middle. You can imagine the bustling work happening to keep these smokestacks smoking and the factories producing their mass-produced products. You can also see workers here on the bleaching grounds laying out textiles to dry in the sunlight. This is not that different. And then breaching the horizon line in the 17th century work, very discernible civic building, civic building, church steeple, and impossible for you to see, I know, but windmills. Very recognizable in the Netherlands to harness the canals and the wind of the Dutch landscape. And so Van Gogh is turning back to his own tradition as a Netherlandish artist, but bringing it up to the present moment. And that's recognizable to art historians as a sort of equivocation. We're not sure how he feels about either the waning agricultural economy or the bustling industrial economy. But smack dab in the middle is the worker. And the worker is almost always present. And it's almost always the place where Van Gogh himself locates his own ego. Although a skilled draftsman, Van Gogh rarely practiced traditional drawing where you draw an outline and then you fill it in and you use things like hatching and shadowing and shading to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. He more often uses color and brushwork, what we call facture, to create the presence, to build up figures through volume. And you can see in both of these works the differentiation of brushwork, for example, in the very spontaneous and repetitive brushwork to create the illusion of this sweeping field of wheat, and then the more careful and finished facture hiding to a large degree the appearance of brushwork in the smoothness and reflective quality of the sky. And the same is true in the differentiation between the way he handles, for example, the solid collar or the straw hat. Ultimately, Vincent has utopian dreams of creating an artist's colony outside of the hustle and bustle of industrialized Paris and to embrace the Provençal light in the south of France. He moves south in 1888. He spends 15 months in Arles, a small Provençal town in the south of France, and its surroundings, and produces 200 fully finished paintings. plus innumerable drawings and illustrated letters to his friend Emile Bernard, to Theo, and to others. It's at this time that he demonstrates his close observational skills of picking up details that you only might notice if you actually go see the work in person or maybe in an immersive experience. His extraordinarily sophisticated color sense, and you see that here, and I will talk about it again in a moment. Look at the limit of how many colors are used on this. Again, the cool colors of bluish, grayish, and then the warm colors of yellow and orange, and yet it feels fully realized. And his increasingly confident and bold stylized brushwork comes fully into play in the Arles period. And he becomes awareness of the push-pull of space. If any of you are artists or have taken art classes, you know that there are a lot of different strategies to create the illusion of three-dimensionality and the illusion that certain things like the hat, like the beard, are coming towards us, whereas the sallow cheeks and the sunken eyes sink back a little farther, and that is enabled partly by draftsmanship, but also by very sophisticated color harmonies. So here's another work that borrows from that landscape tradition that I talked about a minute ago. And yet he's made certain choices to make a stronger editorial choice about what he wants to privilege. Again, notice the horizon line on this view from the wheat fields and compare it to the horizon line on this. Again, I talked about an equalization or equilibrium between city and country. Here, country, the wheat field, and those with scythes cutting the wheat are once again placed right smack dab in the middle in the sweet spot of the painting. But they are fully given, I don't know, 5/6 of the painting, while the city, with again smokestacks and some other clock towers and other things, are given only the top 1/6. But what's hard to see in this, which is important to notice, is that doesn't mean that he doesn't allow modernity into his paintings, because there is a steam train barreling through the top half of this right here with that long trail of steam. And you can almost hear it. It's whistle blasting. And you can almost sense that this scyther, this person cutting the wheat, has stopped briefly to look up and marvel at this miracle of modern technology. There are emblems of past and present: the train, the new housing, gas works, the stifling impasto that's visible when you see this work in person. The smoke stands out from the background and the whole sky is a kind of orangey color. And then the field work, the medieval tower, and the symbolic presence of a reaper. And a reaper symbolically is a bringer of death, right? With the scythe, symbol of death. None of this is accidental. Again, Vincent is deeply read in 4 languages. He knows the symbolism he's peddling here. But he's, in a sense, saying time passes, seasons change. There's a time to reap and a time to sow, a time to plant and a time to harvest. But nature also disappears at the hands of industry. And so that interruption of the modern technology of this train is more of an editorial comment, more of a symbolic comment than in the previous landscape that we looked at. And Petra Chu calls attention to, again, the differentiation of the kinds of brushwork, the uniformly textured surface, and then the up tilted kind of composition that is much more reminiscent of Japanese prints, of which we'll see one in a minute. And then the landscape itself, again, 5/6 of the canvas itself is kind of expressing its own emotional significance. And again, as I mentioned, Van Gogh, if you imagine him standing in front of the easel painting this, the workers are him. The workers are right at his eye level. What about style? Style is a tricky word in the history of art. Some art historians fetishize style. Connoisseurs do. It's how works are appraised and attributed, and fakers are caught. But style is also what makes us fall in love with artists. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Vincent's style is one of the most immediately recognizable in the history of art. Probably almost any one of you could walk into a museum of modern and contemporary art, and you might not recognize 5/6, I'm kind of liking that fraction today, of the works you see, and you might kind of look at many of them and say, why is that art? But somewhere you would say, wait, I know what that is. That's Vincent. I recognize his style, right? This is a work of one of his most famous motifs, sunflowers. And to some degree, Vincent himself also occupies his non-human subjects. He seems to be present again in the sweet spot, the center of even these cut and ultimately dying sunflowers. They're almost anthropomorphic. They seem to be in some ways alive. But they die. And that's part of the presentness of them as well. And in this case, we've been given a close-up, a zoomed in view of these cut flowers. And Vincent uses very specific color theory to create that sense of presentness, in addition to, again, his very distinctive brushwork, which I don't need to call attention to. You can see it yourself in this. Again, the cool colors of the background make the warm colors of the two cut stems pop, to use modern parlance. There are only vague suggestions of shadows here, here, and here, which also contribute to the sense of three-dimensionality. But what mainly makes them seem three-dimensional is the way they stand out, optically speaking, from the cool blues, grays of the background. So quickly, color theory, which was being scientifically studied at the time, and Vincent was completely up to date with that, like Seurat was. Color theory reminds us that warm colors come forward and cool colors recede optically in our brains. And so artists had always sort of intuitively known that. But artists of Van Gogh's period used that knowledge very deliberately, and it's exactly what Seurat's neo-impressionism was. But the choice of subject, the harmony of the way in which these flowers seem in part anthropomorphic and animated, but in another part resigned to their only fate to ultimately dry out and disintegrate. They have an aura of good faith. Van Gogh treats sunflowers with as much integrity, with as much respect as he does peasants, as he does his own self-portrait. They have the appearance of being truly seen, not reproduced through the conventions of art making as an academic artist would, idealizing them, making them look better than life. Instead, Vincent studied them, studied their complexity, the complexity of a sunflower, which is an extraordinarily complex flower. And he's looking for sort of the essential sign of the thing. And every one of his paintings of sunflowers is different for that reason. They are all searching. And each time it's possible that he thinks he got it wrong, like the quote I read at the beginning. And then there's a quality of a work ethic in his work. There's a quality of workmanlike Protestantism in his works. They are, in fact, work, which is why he so very often puts peasants in them, which I'll explain a bit more in a minute. This is one of his works from the Arles period, one of his most famous works from the Arles period. I believe I showed it when I talked about post-impressionism, so I'm just going to point out a couple of parts, pieces of it here. Vincent had a tendency to exaggerate the essential elements that he wanted to call attention to, and then to leave the more obvious parts vague. So the two most exaggerated parts of the night cafe are the gas lamps, which are almost shimmering or vibrating, and the steep, steep perspective. Those are the two most exaggerated parts. The most obvious pictorial elements, the subject matter of the work, the people sort of half asleep at the tables, the owner, watchfully making sure that no one slips out without paying their bill. Those are underplayed. And those are because this was a deeply symbolic painting for Vincent, who was living upstairs at the time and came down 3 nights in a row and sketched on site in largely the only place that was open all night in Arles, thus the title Night Cafe. And Vincent considered it an evil place, a place where souls get lost. And he hated living above it, and it's why he moved into the yellow house as soon as he could. But he recorded it first, and he described it this way. Quote, "So I have tried to express, as it were, the powers of darkness in a low public house by the soft green and malachite contrasting with yellow green and harsh blue greens, and all this in an atmosphere like a devil's furnace of pale sulfur." So you notice there's that highfalutin rhetoric of evil and devils and sin and all of that. It's part of his Protestantism. But he uses the formal qualities, the light, the color, the very specificity of green and malachite, pale sulfur. He uses color, the painter's language, the artist's language, to explain in this letter what he's after here. His friend Gauguin, who I'm going to talk about again in a minute, comes toward the end of 1888. And they spend about 9 harrowing weeks together. And Vincent painted this painting and several other kind of studies of his personal surroundings around this time. And this is called the Artist's Room at Arles. And he considered this a calming painting. It was meant to express restfulness. And yet it has a kind of nervous energy to it. Again, the steep perspective, the way the paintings kind of lean in and over the bed, the vivid colors, many different tones of blue for the walls, lurid red for the bedspread. And so there's, in the context of these the kind of steep perspective and the leaning in, the feeling of almost collapsing in, a kind of claustrophobia, which is then counterbalanced by the humble objects and a humble painting humbly made, which is why it's complex, why it's not one thing or the other. And it is also very much in the tradition of older Dutch interiors, where every piece of iconography has religious significance too. Think of the water pitcher and the towel and the washing of feet, for example. And an even more simple painting, which is called Gauguin's Chair, which is in some ways Van Gogh's portrait of Gauguin without the artist himself, but with his spark of creativity, his light. In a sense, Gauguin and Van Gogh painted side by side, drank side by side, argued side by side. These are two works, one by Vincent, one by Gauguin, Paul Gauguin, of the same subject. Vincent's is called L'Arlésienne, or the Arlesian Woman. Gauguin's names her Madame Genoux, but they're the same person. She's the person in this case in that low country house. I mean, low common public house with the pool table and the red walls. And here she's in a more neutral environment with books and without the degradations of the cigar smoke or pipe smoke and gambling, whatever else you see. Someone is drawing on their screen. Someone in the group is drawing on your screen, and it's appearing on my slides. I don't know if you can see that, but those yellow lines are not on my slides.
I'll fix it.
Thank you. In a sense, though, Gauguin found no appeal in what he called the cheap local color. Thank you, much better. What Van Gogh found in the South, among other things, was this brilliant light, Provençal light. All artists talk about it, how it's very different from Paris, which is often very gray. And in essence, to some degree, that light became his art for the remainder of his short life. And then the love of beauty and life's vibration. And I love this work. This is called Bridge at Arles from 1888. And it actually is the source of a number of works that were inspired by Japanese prints. And here's an example, a work called Sano Pontoon at Kozuke by Hokusai, who Van Gogh worshipped. He wrote that Hokusai could bring him to tears by his line and his drawing. And so works like this, which is a real site in Arles of a drawbridge. But you can see that it is flattened out, it is geometricized, there's no deep space in it. He's very interested in the structure. He's very interested in the play of shapes like the parasol and the mechanics of the drawbridge itself, which will lift it up to allow a bridge to go through. Again, there's a kind of equality of vision here. Nothing is privileged over anything else, and everything is arranged to its maximum visual interest. And that's what he perfects in the months that he spends in Arles. And then he also creates an astonishing set of portraits of locals. someone is still drawing on the screen. And this is a work called La Berceuse, which is essentially the cradle rocker or babysitter. But it's actually a portrait of Madame Roland, Augustine Alix Bellico Roland, who was a denizen of Arles and the wife of the postmaster, who he also painted, Monsieur Roland. In essence, his portraits used his friends and neighbors as models. It wasn't them paying to be painted like commissions, but it was him using their kindness to be able to test out his style. And in fact, he called these works rather vulgar and loud. He loved them for that reason. He wasn't trying to idealize these people. He was trying to get at their sort of salt of the earth quality. And of course, what he's seeking, he does intend to be noble and dignified, and he would consider this a dignified portrait of Madame Roland. But they never idealize, and they most certainly are not photorealistic. She could have had a photographer photograph her, and it would be much more realistic. And then he uses his backgrounds to force objects to take shape in the foreground, as he does here with a reversal of what I talked about earlier with the cool background. Whereas here, the warm colors are in the background and the greens, blues, and grays are in the foreground. And nevertheless, this animation of, for instance, the pipe smoke, the bandaged ear from the event with the cutting off of the ear, the details of which are still highly contested. After which he committed himself to a psychiatric hospital at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle in Saint-Remy. And Saint-Remy was a former monastery that was transformed into what was then called an asylum. We would call it now a psychiatric hospital, about 25 kilometers from Arles. And he created this self-portrait while his ear was still bandaged from the affair, where the ear was cut off, wrapped up, and sent to a local prostitute. Modern scholarship believes that it was Gauguin's temper that severed the ear from the head. We'll probably never know for sure. At Saint-Remy, at the Moselle, Saint-Paul-de-Moselle Psychiatric Hospital, he was given 2 rooms. One that was his living quarters and one where he was allowed to paint. And in the beginning, he painted essentially what was right there in front of him, like this work, The Garden of the Hospital from 1889. And again, as you can see, the influence of Japanese prints, where this foreground, what we call a repoussoir, I pointed this out in a couple places in Cézanne the last time I was there. And then the pattern, the interest in this pattern of the garden is what is more fascinating him than the details of the flora or fauna. And then once again, he drops in some workers in the psychiatric hospital, those who are literally keeping him alive. And it's in some ways, a loving symbol of his front yard. He made a loving portrait of the doctor who kept him alive, Dr. Gachet, and look at that gorgeous blue background. And everything about this painting tells you that this is a deeply loved individual, and that the color harmonies here are intended to say something about Dr. Gachet's personality and love and care and attention. And then his most famous painting made during this time, the Starry Night. And if you've watched any movies or you've gone to the immersive, I know you've learned a bit more about this, but if you think back to the other landscapes I showed, when I talked about the composition, how much is given over to a field, how much is given over to a city, you can see that now that has been utterly upended. And that's where we recognize Vincent's utterly mature style, that no one else could have possibly made this painting, and that it is most definitively an expressive painting as much as it is an observed painting of the physical reality of his surroundings. Note again the tree in the foreground, which grounds the foreground so that we as the viewer will believe that everything unfolds behind that. And yet the tree is also in some ways part of this roiling sky, and the Mediterranean symbolism of this tree reaching up into the sky, which is in some ways a natural replacement for or parallel to the church steeple of the town, also reaching up and above the horizon line and into the sky. So nature and God to some degree, and then this cozy little town tucked into the foothills of the rolling mountains or rolling hills. But it's the sky. It's that roiling cosmic event happening before our very eyes that that we recognize that he's gone beyond observation and into the realm of expressionism. And that's the last bit of this lecture that I want to talk about in my last few minutes, is this mature style. So first about Gauguin. Gauguin and Van Gogh both wanted to go away. They both wanted to get away from the industrialized, modernized hustle bustle of capitalist Paris. Gauguin initially went north to Brittany, the Bretagne region of France. And then, as we know, he eventually went farther and farther away to the South Seas, to Tahiti and farther away. But in between those two, he went and spent those 9 weeks with Van Gogh, but they were actually communicating before that. And what they were communicating about was the difference between the observed scene and the imagined scene. Van Gogh argued that you had to paint from life, even if you removed your work from that observed scene, that your work should be rooted in the real observed reality of what you were painting, whether the peasant, the dramatic sky, the flora and fauna, again, notice the tree, the field, the factory, the church. Gauguin argued that art took flight in the imagination. And so he fabricated scenes, what he called synthetism. He synthesized different elements. These observed, deeply pious women in Brittany, and then what he imagined was going on in their heads after they saw this or heard this fiery sermon from their pastor about Jacob wrestling with the devil. And Gauguin abandoned local color and made the ground a lurid red. And then he played with perspective and scale and size. And he basically placed himself in the imaginations of these women. Whereas Vincent, even when he borrowed from other artists like Millet, who I mentioned earlier, and even when he departed from photorealism, nevertheless was always very much externalizing his own ego with what he was depicting. Peasants, flora, fauna like sunflowers, etc. And we return once again to noticing now that he has resolved the figure-ground relationship in this work, which is an homage to the artist Millet, who painted the same subject, the sower. But we've seen, again, peasants, field workers in the field, but I called your attention to that horizon line. And before this, the peasant was always locked in below the horizon line. And here, the peasant breaches it in order to be closer to this incredibly spiritually lit sun. And so while this is nevertheless a work of stylistic boldness and innovation, what they were arguing about is that Van Gogh would say this was honestly envisioned, while as this was a work of imagination. And so this had more integrity. That's what they were arguing about. And they came to blows about it. That's how dead serious it was. And it could have been about religion. It could have been about different ways of expressing masculinity. It could have been about a lot of things. But in the end, it was fatal, in a sense, because they couldn't come to an agreement and they just got on each other's nerves. Finally, this last slide is, in fact, a work that was brought to light in a different manner by the late John Berger, the great British scholar, poet, artist, who died last year, or 2 years ago, died a couple of years ago. And he called our attention to this work from 1890, the year that Van Gogh either took his own life or was killed by hooligans. We'll never know that either. It's always been considered a suicide, but recently some have posited that he was actually murdered. Murder. Crows Over Wheatfield, 1890. We recognize many of the signature aspects, the bold and differentiated brushwork, the color harmonies, cool blues in the background, vivid, warm oranges and yellows in the foreground, cut by cool greens to give us the path where we can imagine, again, walking right into this sweet spot. This is where he imagines himself, again, always in the middle, always externalizing his ego into the middle. But Berger called attention to the way that words have skewed our understanding of works. And that brings me full circle back to the tortured genius that I talked about. This is the last painting Van Gogh made before he killed himself. Now, that is to some degree a statement of fact. At least we believe it is the last painting he worked on before he killed himself. When we read these words, we are then inclined to read into this path without end, these startled crows, and crows are always black crows, a harbinger of death. We read into it iconography that either is or is not there. And so what I want to leave you with is, before I switch over to letting you comment or ask questions or tell me a bit about the immersive exhibition or some of the films, is that we should always, always start with looking, not reading. Always start with looking, not reading. And so one final anecdote. A pair of shoes, 1886. Van Gogh made several paintings which would be considered still lives with shoes. In this case, 1886, we step back in time a little bit, a pair of down at heel, well-worn shoes, and we speculate about poverty, the inability to afford a new pair, and so to keep these going as long as he can, humble, well-used, well-worn, well-observed. And that poses all kinds of psychological questions about the fraught symbolism of the motifs that the artist chooses. They've been seen as symbolizing Vincent's difficult passage through life. And yet, a fellow student in Paris, where he was studying at the time that he made this, reported that Vincent bought these workman's boots at a flea market, intending to use them as a still life. And yet he found them a little too smart. And so he wore them on a long, rainy walk. And only then did he take them off, leave them to dry, and paint them. So in fact, the words do matter to peel away some of the mythology about the tortured genius. And that's where you find the remarkable true genius of the artist. I end as I began, with his own words. There is nothing more truly artistic than to love people. There's my email. If you want to send me an email, ask me a question. And if you want to follow me, I'll warn you, my Instagram is very political. Just a warning, I wear my politics on my sleeve, but I also do a lot of art history. And I'm curating an exhibition at FAU right now, which I would love for you to follow and to come to. Opening reception on January 20th. I can send you information, or Tammy information, to disseminate about that exhibition. It's actually an exhibition of FAU's own art collections, of which we have very eclectic collections. And I will stop there. So tell me about the immersive. Tell me about the movies. Ask me questions.
Yes. Anybody would like to chime in about going to the immersive or any of the movies that we watched, or any questions? I will start it off. So Dr. Leader, when I was like watching a lot about Van Gogh and watching him paint, he outlined just about everything in black. And I'm just like, that's pretty distinguishing, mark of his paintings that you see. So is, besides that and his colors and his depth and his brush marks, has anybody come close to, forge, like you said, you're mimicking his works? And why do you think he outlined it?
The outlining is it's the basic building block of drawing, but generally you start by learning, like we all do, right? Like we draw an outline of our hand or whatever, and then we draw a stick figure or whatever. And then drawing teaches you how to make that outline disappear. You eventually cover it up with all kinds of other things. What Van Gogh did is he never really tried to cover it up. He always made his basic building blocks of picture making visible. And so you can still often see those original outlines on his fully realized paintings. And so he didn't try to hide them. And that was considered very anti-academic. It's a signature, and it's a signature feature of his works that he didn't try to hide those outlines, that he didn't try to mask his own means of making. And connoisseurs who really, really follow the development of his style notice that what those outlines ultimately became are his signature brushwork. So his brushwork continued to be kind of using the strokes that are the same strokes as an outline, unblended, laid down what we call alla prima. So lay down a stroke and then don't do anything to it, leave it as it is. There have been successful forgers of him. I actually include one in another lecture that I give. There was a very successful forger who then got outed and then became a detective, a forgery detective. in the earlier part of the 20th century. But the outlining, the draftsmanship, that's one of the ways that appraisers, authenticators, and connoisseurs will determine if they think that a work is actually a work of Vincent or a copy by someone else or a forgery. And then they can also date them over the short period of his career as his brushwork got more sophisticated, from, say, the time of the Potato Eaters to the time of the Starry Night. His style became really fully developed. So really interesting question. Did I answer it even remotely?
Yes, yes. Mrs. Greenberger, you have a question? No? Okay, so how about this? How many people have, no, just, how many members went to the immersive exhibit? And then there was the other one, the three.
Yeah. I went to one in New York. It was little,
Right.
the one in New York was very quick though. I don't know if all of them are like that.
There was two. You had the immersive, and then you had the experience, the Van Gogh experience.
I don't know which one. It was right on the river and right on the East River
Yeah.
in New
Well,
York.
Well, if anybody wants to go to the immersive experience, it ends on the 9th. And I do have some complimentary passes that you can use. You just have to email me or call me, and I will gladly give you some complimentary passes to go see the immersive experience, which ends on the 9th.
Oh, soon. And
Yes.
if you do have questions, you know, there's the reactions down at the bottom of your screen. You can raise your hand. You can wave.
So what
Yeah.
movies? Yes, anybody?
I don't know. Tammy?
Yes.
Sheila. Yeah, I have a question. I have never seen the one painting with the factory buildings and the wheat fields. That I would have never associated it with the kind of thing like Starry Night, or even of the people he painted in all.
That's right. And he didn't do it very often. You're astute to notice that. He eventually almost ran away from modernity. The pictures that I showed, and that's one of them, Agnières is in the environs. It's not Paris, but it's in the environs of Paris, at outskirts, if you will. And he made some drawings and some paintings of what we would call modern subjects. And then he retreated to the south of France and stopped doing that largely. The night cafe could be considered a modern subject, but largely he abandoned modern subjects, even though his style is utterly modern. It's not academic. It's not traditional. It's not what would have been sought after in the salons. And that's why he didn't sell his work, because it looked too, messy or whatever to people. But that factory painting, I like teaching it. Petra Chu, who's a 19th century scholar, writes really eloquently about that work. And so I quoted her a couple of times and dropped her name, because nothing that I say is necessarily original to me. I do a lot of reading of other scholars. But she writes very closely about that work and about how those two works that I showed, the one that's in Agnières and has all the smokestacks, and then the one is after he moves to Arles that has the train racing through it. They're both commentaries on his relationship with what I'm calling modernity, modern life, the modernity that is rooted in the Industrial Revolution. One is still kind of embracing it, and then the next one is kind of putting it in the background and kind of hoping it'll go away. But that train zooms in and interrupts that kind of pastoral scene. So you're right, it is unusual, but I think it's worthy of some scrutiny, because it very much speaks to the ambiguity of how Vincent saw himself. He wanted to be up to date. He didn't want to be a traditional artist. He didn't want to do academic paintings. He wanted to be distinctive. He wanted to be speaking to the moment, to the time that he was living in. But he also didn't want to live in Paris, and he didn't want to go to, nightclubs, and he didn't want to hobnob with the hoi polloi. So there's a tension in those two works that I showed together. I think that you're exactly right to point out.
Sandy Purcell, one of our members, has her hand up.
Yes.
The last painting that he did, if you could put that back up on the screen for a second. If you look at that one, stop. Yeah. If you look at the clouds all the way in the back, and do you see the middle cloud? If you look to the right of it, it looks like a person with arms up and a body. No, go all the way over to the right. Yeah, just a little bit above it, near the cloud, right there, stop. Do you see the face and a hat and the arm?
Like a snowman, almost.
No.
Oh, I see it.
Like
I
a
see it. It has a
drummer.
little, has like a little ribbon on the hat, like a little beanie.
Right. It looks like a drummer beating on the cloud.
Yeah, the black is the stick.
Hat, arms,
Yeah.
shoulders. Uh-huh. Huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, did you have a thought about that?
Do I have a thought about it?
Yeah.
I just thought that it looked like a person in the middle of the sky. And I was wondering if he superimposed himself into that sky in that form, or did you notice that there was like a person there?
No, I've never noticed that, I will admit. I don't think you're wrong to see it, because once you described it, I was able to point it out with my cursor, right?
Right. It looks, yeah.
It almost looks to me, all of us have had the experience of reading things in clouds. There's right. And so I don't think he would be tell you that you're wrong. To me, it looks like a conductor nature, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. And no, I've never noticed it. I've always been interested in other aspects of this, but of course now I'll never be able to let that go. And now I will credit you.
I'm sorry.
And then I've always been interested. I've always been interested with how the one thing I always have noticed is how this crow seems to be caught in the cloud.
Right.
Seems to be kind of captured in the cloud and can't fly free. And that seems to me symbolic too. And Van Gogh, to be clear, was not a careless painter. He was a very careful painter, even though his paintings look spontaneous, as we know from his letters. And we don't necessarily know if this painting is fully finished. So that's interesting.
And then do you see where what you think that crow is that's caught in it? If you look above it in the sky, go a little bit higher up, right there. That's a beak. Do you see the beak and an eye? And the bird itself in the middle of the sky?
What
It
you
looks
have
like a
to do,
crow.
you have to go to Amsterdam and see this painting and report back to us.
Oh, right.
I'm being a little bit facetious, but reproductions are famously unreliable. And I would love to know if these things are as visible when you see this work in person, when you step up close to it, step back away from it. It's a larger painting. So I'd be very curious. It's really
Doctor, I'm not going in the middle of COVID. Thank you very much.
No, me neither. Me neither. But someday we will travel again, I hope. Some of us.
Yeah, but don't you think it looks like a crow too?
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. Fascinating. Good eye. You have a very good eye. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, it's getting to be 9:20, and appreciate you guys all hanging in there. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Leader. And everybody, don't forget that Sunday the 16th, we have our in-person, no, our virtual lecture again on the list of 2022. So look out for the email that we're sending out tomorrow with all the updates for all our events, all of the events going on. So that is going to go out tomorrow. And so if you have any questions, you know where to find me. But thank you, everybody, and have a great night. Thank you, Dr. Leader.
Thanks, Tammy, and thanks everyone for being here. I can't wait till I get to see you in person again.
Yes, same here. All righty.
Thank you.
Take care and take care of your goal. Bye.
Yes.
Thank you.